What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of A Moment with MaddDog. So, a little while ago, on one of the book reviews that I posted, I talked about how I have took a lot of notes, or a decent amount of notes, when I was reading After I Do by Taylor Jenkins Reid, right? And kind of like a little recap of the book, real quick, and it's going to go into what we're talking about today. Is that, this book is about a married couple that, after how many years after being married, they hit a hard place in their marriage, and they're kind of going the unconventional route to rebuild their marriage, right? And they decided to split up for a year, and then not be with each other, date other people, kind of figure out who they were without outside of their marriage, and then eventually come back together a year later and figure out what they were going to do, right? And I like taking notes. I like to learn things, whether it be from nonfiction or fiction books, right? So also, as a disclaimer, a lot of the stuff, some of the podcasts I'm going to be in the upcoming week, I'm going to be talking about some of the ideas that are talked about in this book. Henceforth, why I have so many tabs that are in this book, right? And, so that's what I'm going to be doing today. Essentially, I guess you could say a book breakdown, right? I guess you could say. And so, there are a couple topics that are, like I said, that I'd like to talk about in this book. One, and this kind of relates to a book I'm going to talk about in the upcoming weeks, is essentially receiving advice from someone, right? So, in this book, Lauren is going through it, right? Her marriage is in shambles. She's on this year split with her husband, and she's dating other people. She's talking to other people, kind of getting advice, right? Advice from others, whether it be relationship advice, life advice, all that stuff, right? On how to proceed, and during this time in her life, right? And her her grandmother, bless her soul, she was an old soul. She was married for, 20 to 30 plus years, if I remember correctly. And, her grandma gave her advice when her grandma first heard about her being split from her husband, right? And essentially, her advice was not, I wouldn't say not the best. It was essentially advice to instill jealousy in him, right? To kind of instill jealousy in her, to kind of get her riled up, right? The advice that her grandma gave her was, she asked her granddaughter if she threw cocktail parties, and she's like, "Mom, Grandma, why does that even matter?" And she's like, "Well, if you threw cocktail parties, you would be closer with your husband." And then she goes into detail on why throwing cocktail parties was important. Essentially, it would instill jealousy in her because she would see her husband talking to all these girls, um, spiking up a conversation. She'll get jealous. They'll come back, and essentially go from there, after the party and stuff. And so, one of two things. Okay, first is that I don't think, this is aside from the main point I'm going to make, but I don't think throwing cocktail parties just to make your significant other essentially jealous, or make yourself jealous, is essentially a good relationship habit to have. I personally think it might be on the verge of potentially a toxic habit, right? Like, if you're in a bad spot in your marriage or a bad spot in your relationship, and to make things better, kind of like make them jealous, make them, you know, see what potential it could be if you were with someone else. If you're having a conversation with someone else, right? And instill this jealousy in yourself and or in them, and just do that every so often, however often it may be. I personally think that is a toxic cycle to get into, right? Because you can be jealous anywhere. You can be jealous when you're out in public and they talk to someone else. You can be jealous, like at the cocktail party. You can be jealous of who they even have a crush on or whatever, right? At the end of the day, like it's it's just not the grandma. We get it. It worked for her, but at the end of the day, I don't personally think that was the best idea. But however, that's not the point that I was trying to make. Okay, so the grandma gave advice. She's like, if you threw more cocktail parties, X, Y, and Z would happen. And this is kind of relating to a book that I recently finished, and I'm going to talk about in an upcoming podcast. And I just finished the book called The Happiness Equation, right? And essentially, the author talks about the steps. There's 9 steps to equal happiness, right? The main formula is for happiness is want nothing, do everything, and then you get happiness. Okay, and one of the last steps and the key to happiness is don't take advice. Okay, and I think this is one of the prime examples of where not taking advice is probably the perfect response you could get. Now, I'm not saying advice is bad. Advice is not bad. Like some people, especially people who have been through it, and they are very reliable resources and they're very trustworthy and you resonate with their story and they give advice, like sure, like take their advice or whatever. But, how often do you meet those people? How often are you listening to their stories or reading their books or listening to their podcast, right? Or whatever it may be. And also, too, at the end of the day, most likely you've met these people or heard about these people because they have similar, they like the same things as you. They have similar career paths as you, right? They have similar beliefs, like, yes, open-mindedness is, I think, a forgotten personality or trait that we all should have, and I will open-mindedness to people, beliefs, studies, ways of life, whatever it may be, right? But at the end of the day, when we get advice from someone, sorry, there's someone outside my window. At the end of the day, advice, no matter whose advice is given, what advice is given to us, we are most likely going to have already either made our decision or we're going to choose a decision based on who we are and how we feel and what our beliefs are, right? So even if the advice is fantastic advice, right? At the end of the day, we're going to choose what we think is best, no matter what we hear or what we say or do. Okay? And this book is a great example of Lauren getting advice. And she essentially, at the end of the book, she followed her heart. She followed what she wanted. She wanted to get back with her husband. She wanted to contact him. And she eventually did that, right? I don't think advice is bad. But if we are waiting if we're going through stuff and we are looking for someone for advice, right? When all along that maybe some of the best steps we could have taken to resolve the issue was taking the first step based on our own beliefs, our own personalities, and what we feel. Now, there are caveats to this, right? Especially if we want to improve ourselves, if we want to get better, we I think in situations like that, taking advice and maybe trying to lean into it and practicing whatever advice is given, I think that's totally fine. Okay? Like improving ourselves over the course of our lifetime, never becoming stagnant, never stopping learning, which are also tips in the key to happiness, right? Are key things we need to do as a person, right? In order to continue to grow and in order to eventually find happiness, right? But at the same token, when it comes to those hard decisions on what we want to do, at the end of the day, What matters is what we believe on what we feel is right. You know, even it was pointed out in that book, the happiness equation, that sometimes advice is counter contradicts one another. You know, the most famous, what's the word for it? It's not catchphrase, um, but or slogans, whatever it is. Sometimes, like for example, you can't teach a dog an old dog new tricks, right? Even stuff like that um, is contradictory with other advice that is out there, right? And um, the short of the matter is that advice is great, but at the end of the day, you need to make a decision based on who you are, what your own beliefs and your own way about like what you believe in, what you like what you want to do, what you think is right, and then roll with it. Um, I like I said, I'm not against advice. Sometimes I will take advice, but more so it's for physical change, right? And rethinking like mindset structure. But when it comes to advice about situations and people and stuff, I tend that the more I lean towards who I am as a person and the decisions I make based on who I am, I've 9 times out of 10 been happier than if I went against the grain and went against who I am as a person in the decisions that I've made. Um, and that's it for this moment with MaddDog. Like I said, in the upcoming podcast, we're going to talk about more ideas from after I do. Um, so be on the lookout for that. Again, I highly recommend this book, not just for a pleasure read, but maybe if you're someone that wants to resonate with a book that might be going through a similar thing, I highly recommend this book. Other than that, I'm Danielle MaddDog Manetti, and I'll see you guys next time on another episode of A Moment with MaddDog.